What I'm going to talk about is this idea of risk as an evolution process. I think we've got across the idea that maybe risk is a process. And if Middleton from UCL is anywhere near correct, and I think she is, that evolution is a signature of any complex adaptive system. I'm quite clear that risk, and when people are involved in risk assessments, we have a complex adaptive system. So this is why I'm interested in it. So what can we use from this? And how can we use that concept to try and model and understand risk better? So we've got a technique here, or a combination of techniques really. And what we find that this is quite useful is for giving a rather rigorous classification system for risks. And it allows us to start understanding the dynamic of risk, which might lead us to make some assumptions maybe about emerging risks, the holy grail. It's giving us an insight into how the organization links these risks in their own perception. So this gives a very unique organizational footprint as well. And it finally gives us, where we started from on this actually, is the interconnectivity or a connectivity factor between the risks. And it gives a robust approach to that. I've talked about this a little bit at the colloquium, so I'm not going to go into the detail of the methodology too much, except for to maybe go through a case study, which we've had from one of Neil's clients. So a lot of the terminology on here is as I'm not an actuary, maybe doesn't make sense, but I'm going to try and take you through this case study very quickly. Here's some justification for our approach, or the cladistics approach to looking at evolution. We seem to be able to fit quite easily into a Darwinian definition of what evolution is if we look at it from a risk perspective. And others have taken this approach, Pagel and McCarthy in particular, from a linguistic analysis, which is written up in Nature. And McCarthy has used this for industry groupings to make quite an interesting approach to strategy. And clearly this has come from the biological sciences, where the software is actually evolving incredibly quickly. And they're even trying to use this in pharmaceutical companies now to predict from the DNA and the breakdown of bacteria into what might be new bacteria that emerge, so they can get a head start on the drugs research for those particular bacteria that they're anticipating emerging. So risk evolution is kind of quite neat in a way, because this is looking at the interface with the organization and the environment, at least philosophically. And that means that changing fitness landscape, as it were, this should be taking account of that. And so any controls in the environment will actually affect the risk, and hence this low-flying aircraft, the very fact that you try and put some controls up there seem to actually influence the risk or make it a bit more likely that something's going to hit it. It does seem to produce this quite reliable evolutionary information for us, and gives us some insight into how the state of the risk is at the present moment in time. And this is, I think, how I try to explain it to other people who are maybe not in the field, is this is the process, trying to understand how that risk got to be the way it is. And what we do is break down that risk into individual characteristics of the risk, and then use that in a DNA type analysis. So this is one I've shown before, and I'm not going to go through this too much, but this is typically what the data set would look like. These would look like risks or risk scenarios in our language, and these would be the characters of that particular risk. And here what we're doing is actually basically saying, you know, a lamprey, which probably only Martin, being Scottish, will know what a lamprey is, but it's a very sort of basic animal that is just a mouth. It's a rotating mouth. It doesn't have much else than that, and an eel-like body. And so what we can say from this is how and why is a lamprey different from these other species, and why is a salmon and a lizard different from a shark. And this is what this is telling us, is from that very specific data that we have on it. So that's the principle, which is kind of well developed in the biological sciences. And the approach here that we've used in this case study to be able to develop a methodology that is getting more and more pragmatic, honest, is when we've got a number of less than 20 risks, it actually is quite straightforward, and there are packages available, Mega probably being the most popular, and these have all got free downloads, Philippe, Mystique and C-Tree. Now we actually use a bit of a combination of all of these to be able to achieve when we've got more risks and when we actually get big data risk sets, because we need to sort of hone those down to get trees that make sense and then recombine them. So there is a little bit of technique in here, but I'm not going to bore you with that. There are some nice metrics to keep us as a check whether this process is robust. And one is a retention index, which looks at, is this giving us reliable evolutionary characteristic data, and a consistency data index, which is looking at, is the data fit for this sort of analysis. And this is a bit of an issue in the risk area. It is different from biological samples because many organizations, until we educate them, don't view risks from having multiple characters. It just seems to be that risk is about money and that's it, or the risk has got one characteristic that they put in a risk register, and there's not the richness of the description of the risk. Fortunately, we see enterprise risk management software programs coming on the market, and many organizations, many engineering organizations indeed, are using these and are getting more and more sophisticated in capturing this sort of data on specific risks and risk scenario, which means that this technique is likely to be a bit more useful in the future. So we have a process here for doing it. When we've got a tree, or there's two things we're looking for, is one, how do we classify these risks, and also how do we then start interpreting the trees. We'll have a look at a tree in a second. And sorry, I just need to go back. The data that we were given in this case study, which is a real company and real data, has about 58 characters, and not every risk has 58 characters in there. It might only be one, or it might be 5 or 6. And the data was split into countries. This particular insurance company had 6 country data that we were given, and so we've analysed these by country and then combined. But what we're looking for in these characters are the characters where there is a character present in this group or not. This is called a clade. So we're trying to look at clades of how these are formed. Which characters are most present or most absent in a particular group? How are these compared to other groups, so we can start comparing? Are there the sorts of characteristics, similar characteristics that we might expect? So there does become a bit of an interpretation once the tree is drawn. Are some groups more diverse than others, and are some groups much larger than others? Do one ancestral characteristic account for many of the risks? That's quite important to know. These are the 58 characters that were in the data that we were given. So this is the way that insurance companies are now collecting data, and this isn't, I'm not sure if this was Solvency II compliant, but this is the way that insurance companies, when financial institutions will start going, is they're characterizing their risks under these headings. So this sort of richness is going to start being required by regulators. So if you imagine that sort of coding is there. This is the sort of data. This is Ireland. And I've only just given you a sample of those characters, but that goes off across here. And each of these risks has a description. And as we can see, we just basically put in, does it have that character or does it not? We've not yet got to the sophistication in the software to be able to, or the analysis indeed, to say whether it's 0.8 or 0.1. We're just saying, is there evidence of this at all, or yes or no? Then this is a tree that's generated from, this particular tree is generated out of Misquik software, which gives us, is quite smart because it gives us an automatic calculation of the characters. So what this is actually saying, and I've put these labels on here, the software doesn't give us this, but what we're actually saying here is this clade which is D, which should be encompassing all of those, it's slipped down somehow. Its ancestor, where it's come from, is from pricing. So they all have an ancestral background of pricing. But here is something a little different. Here it's lost that pricing characteristic. So this is a little odd one. Why is this risk here in Island 10 actually lost that characteristic? Is it changing into something? That would be one that would immediately catch our attention. It's in the clade of the ancestor with this, but it's now lost that characteristic. What's that telling us? So there's immediately something of interest. We can see some that are static, there's no changes, and indeed the theory would say that risks that don't change, the characters are not changing, tend to be more stable. And down the bottom here we have a bifurcation of the risks, and again that's the grandfather of that clade, that's the grandfather of this one. So now this gives us something a little bit interesting to think about. Up here we can see a very complex or busy risk with many characteristics, certainly much more than most of the others. That again is something that we would look at from a risk management perspective, saying, well, there's something going on there. Maybe that's going to be very easy to pick up more characters. And indeed, this turns out to be the economic downturn in Ireland. So there's two things there. Is, okay, that makes a bit of sense, because if you start saying, well, of all these characteristics that we've got to label a risk, an economic downturn for insurance companies sure as hell should be ticking a lot of those boxes. Now, what we could be saying then to the risk manager is, look, that's not a very well-defined risk. Maybe there needs to be some more refinement in this. That's too bland. We need a better description. What we also tend to find in here is where we get this bifurcation and it happens continuously, this is where we're more likely to see new emerging risks. This is like the idea of the jungle has more evolution because it's hot, there's more energy, there's more change. You will see more new species there than you will in the North Pole. So it's that sort of concept that we would look for and say it is more likely to see something come from here, and in fact where we see a lot of changes here, than it would be in these. So we're giving some idea of where we can give attention. So that's around the classification, which in its own right is actually usually interesting, because we're saying you should manage these risks in a similar way, and these risks in a similar way, not just all the risks in the same way. So that's becoming quite an interesting factor.